And this continues our grammar game plan unit with a focus on grammar game plan error number 7, unnecessary commas. By the end of this lesson, you need to be able to define and identify appositives, participial phrases, and adjectival clauses. You also need to be able to explain and identify the comma rules for appositives, participial phrases, and adjectival clauses. And you need to be able to use commas to properly punctuate appositives, participial phrases, say that 10 times fast, and adjectival clauses. Make sure you pause and put this in your notes so you know what your objectives are. And moving on to cue words, we have commas, we have appositive, participial phrases, adjectival clauses, and the necessary comma rule. Again, pause and put these in your notes. So as a reminder, commas are just punctuation marks that we use to indicate a pause, separate items or phrases, or join sentences with a coordinating conjunction. We use commas to help keep our ideas clear and make sentences flow nicely. And you're supposed to have this in your notes. An appositive, if you don't remember, is a noun or a pronoun that comes after another noun or pronoun, and it's used to identify, rename, or explain the noun or pronoun that came first. So let's look at one of these. Our captain being a noun or pronoun, Katie Wu, another noun or pronoun, won the race. Katie Wu explains who the captain is and therefore renames and explains that first one. Thus, Katie Wu is an appositive. We also have appositive phrases, which are an appositive and all of its modifiers, like Uncle Joe, my favorite uncle, cooks well. Uncle is a noun explaining Uncle Joe, but this one's an appositive phrase because we also have the modifiers my and favorite describing uncle. I want you to stop and think for a minute. In our first example, the appositive Katie Wu is not surrounded by commas, but in the second example, it is, and you're going to need to know why. So think and maybe jot your ideas in your notes. Why does one appositive get commas and the other does not? Make sure you have all this information in your notes. Moving on to participial phrases. These are a phrase that are made up of a past participle or a present participle and its modifiers, which of course brings you to the question, what the heck is a participle? A participle is a verb form. In other words, a word that is usually a verb that can be used either as a helping verb or an adjective. In this case, we're focusing on everything that acts like an adjective. The present participle always ends in ing. Your past participle ends in ed, or the irregular past form of the verb. So to sum this back up, a participial phrase is a phrase that's made up of a verb form in either present ending in ing or past that's acting as an adjective. For example, the well-known coach, honored by the victory, led the team. Honored by the victory has our past participle, seen honored, ending with ed. That's usually a verb, but this time this phrase is modifying well-known coach, and thus it's acting as an adjective and is a participle instead of a verb. And we also have the exhibit displaying Egyptian pharaohs related to what the students were learning in class. Displaying is our present participle, ends in ing, and displaying Egyptian pharaohs is acting as an adjective by specifying what exhibit they're talking about. Once again, take some time to contemplate why one of these phrases in our examples got commas, but the other one did not. And also remember that the key here is these phrases act like adjectives. Even though they start with a word that looks like a verb, they are starting a phrase that acts like an adjective. Last but not least, make sure you've paused and put all of this in your notes. And coming up on adjectival clauses, this is a subordinate clause that modifies a noun or a pronoun. If you don't remember, a subordinate clause is also called a dependent clause, and this means that we have a group of words with its own subject and verb but it cannot be a complete sentence because it does not have a complete idea. For example, my best friend, who has written songs based on her life, is a musician. Who has written songs based on her life is a subordinate clause. We have a subject, who, and a verb, written, but who has written songs based on her life is not a complete sentence. In this case, it's acting as an adjective and describing my best friend. We also have the museum that has a lot of exhibits about history is my favorite to visit. That is a subject, has is a verb, that has a lot of exhibits is therefore a subordinate clause, and because it's describing museum, it's an adjectival clause, but it's not a complete sentence. Both of these are examples of adjectival clauses. Again, you should notice that one of them is getting a comma, but the other is not. Why is this happening? Make sure you pause and put this in your notes. Now, what did you notice through those 3 rundowns of participial phrases, adjectival clauses, and appositives? Jot what you noticed about those 3 things, what they all did the same or differently, etc., in your notes, and then move on. What I noticed was that all of these elements act as adjectives. They're all describing nouns or pronouns. Sometimes they got commas and sometimes they do not. And this is what we're trying to figure out what's going on. What is the difference between when these elements get commas and when they do not? And yes, I did just call them elements. So if you're remembering past lessons, you should be coming up with the answer. That is, it's whether or not the element in question is essential to the meaning of the sentence. Is it essential or non-essential? They only get commas when they're non-essential. How do we tell the difference? Essential elements are adjectival phrases or clauses of some variety. They complete the idea or sentence, and they are absolutely relevant, needed to clarify the noun that it's modifying. So usually they tell us something about the subject we need to know because it makes a difference if we don't know it. For example, the belongings of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun are on display at the History Museum. There's a big difference between the belongings of the Egyptian pharaoh and the belongings of Tutankhamun because there are several pharaohs and only one Tutankhamun. We also see the exhibit displaying Egyptian pharaohs related to what the students were studying in class. Displaying Egyptian pharaohs tells us exactly what exhibit we're talking about, whereas if we just said the exhibit related to what students were studying in class, we don't know anymore what they're talking about. On the flip side, your non-essential elements are still adjectival phrases or clauses, but they can be taken out of the sentence without making it incomplete, and they are not relevant to the main idea of the sentence or needed to clarify who or what the subject is. So, Hawaii, a small state in the area, is one of 2 states not part of the contiguous United States, wouldn't be any different. Hawaii is still one of 2 states not part of the contiguous United States, regardless of how big it is. Also, Hawaii, ratified as a state in 1950, is the most recent state to be admitted to the Union. Ratified as a state in 1950 is irrelevant to when the state became admitted to the Union in terms of how recent. So the rule is that we only place commas around non-essential adjectival phrases and clauses. If it's essential, it doesn't get commas and the commas are unnecessary. I want you to take some time practicing identifying essential or non-essential. I've underlined some elements in the following sentences, and you need to decide whether we need them to make that sentence make the sense it is, or whether it's not really relevant to identifying the subject. Pause your video, jot these in your notes, give them a shot. And more practice. This time, we're going to correctly punctuate the following sentences. You might need to add commas, take commas out, or maybe it's correct and you can just write correct. Again, pause your video, jot these down, and go ahead and punctuate them correctly. Please remember, we're only worried about commas right now. And end punctuation. You should always be worried about end punctuation. So to wrap up, commas are punctuation used to indicate pauses, separate items, or help coordinating conjunctions join sentences. They are not needed to separate appositives, participial phrases, or adjectival clauses if those clauses and phrases are essential to the meaning of the sentence. So when they're essential, we don't use commas. Don't forget to answer the questions and submit your Go formative to get credit for this activity.